PowerShell scripting, prompting for input, and producing output. This is the basics. This is actually going to help set us up so we can start doing some interesting stuff. But before we can really start writing a script, we have to have a means of telling it what to do and a means of letting it display its results. One of the concepts we'll have to cover is the fact that in PowerShell, writing things to the screen is not technically output. And along the same lines, creating a file on disk or making a registry key or whatever else, it's not technically output either. PowerShell has a very kind of specific use for the word output. So we're going to talk about different ways to create output. Now, one of those will be writing to the screen, which is writing to the host. And similarly, from an input perspective, where we're gathering data from people, I'll show you how to gather that from the host as well, meaning prompting them, letting them type it on the keyboard. But the real different forms of PowerShell output include writing to the actual output stream, the verbose stream, and several others that we'll take a look at. And Windows PowerShell actually has several different ways that it can provide information to you. Now, I'm using that phrase, provide information, very purposefully. These different means of providing information to you, there are actually 6 total. 5 of them are called pipelines. Now, we've talked about the pipeline a lot already. You can kind of think of it as this. We're going to call this the output pipeline. Now, you run commands. They put objects into the pipeline, and then they pass that data to one another down the pipeline from command to command to command. And then at the end of the pipeline, whatever's left comes out, and PowerShell has to decide what to do with it. We're going to talk about that in just a sec. For right now, let's just leave that in the end of the pipeline. There are actually other pipelines. We have a verbose pipeline. There's also the debug pipeline. There's the error pipeline. And finally, the warning pipeline. Now, internally, PowerShell keeps track of these using a number, and I've not listed them in numeric order here. I've kind of listed them in the order that they occurred to me. So here's the deal. You can put information into any one of these pipelines. For example, I know a lot of folks when they write scripts, they really like the script to display some kind of step-by-step information about what it's doing. You know, I'm about to open the file. I'm working on the first user. I created the first user account. I added him to a group. That type of step-by-step stuff. And that's fine. That's great information to have on the screen because it lets you know the script is working. The verbose pipeline is the right place to put that information. Now, sometimes you also need to display debugging information, and we're going to talk about that in upcoming nuggets, and there's a debug pipeline for that. If you need to warn whoever's running your script, hey, something went wrong, but I'm going to keep going, that might be information you put into the warning pipeline. Now, again, we're just putting information into pipelines. We don't actually get to decide how that gets communicated to the user. PowerShell does that. And different PowerShell hosting applications, such as the console and the ISE, may display that information differently. In the console application, all of these pipelines, at the end of the day, connect to the screen. When you display a warning, when you put information into the warning pipeline, the console application interprets that as an instruction to put yellow text on the screen. When you put information into the error pipeline, the console application interprets that as an instruction to put red text onto the screen. So at the end of the day, when you're using the console, it's sometimes difficult to understand there's these 5 different pipelines in the background because all of the output eventually winds up on the screen. You can also write directly to the screen yourself, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The difference with these pipelines, though, is that different hosting applications could interpret them differently. For example, let's say you have a runbook automation tool that uses Windows PowerShell. It might interpret the verbose pipeline as an instruction to write something to a log file because you're going to be running these scripts unattended, And the verbose pipeline going into a log file might be a way to capture some status information that you could review later. So different hosting applications have different rules for what they do with the 5 pipelines. Now we're going to focus primarily on the console application, but just remember, even though everything seems to be appearing on the screen at the end of the day, it's really flowing through these pipelines to get there. Now we can go into the shell and start playing with some of this. I'm going to do everything in version 2 of Windows PowerShell because nothing here has really changed beyond that. There's another little trick I can show you in version 3 when we kind of come to the end here. So let's just start with a clean slate and the write host command. The neat thing about the write host command is it lets you specify foreground colors and background colors. So you can kind of make a neat little attractive colored display, catch someone's attention. But this does not write to any of the 5 pipelines. This is drawing pixels directly onto the screen. Here's a good example. You probably remember from the previous nugget, I have this sample script that displays that information. Let's take a look at that just to quickly refresh and remind you that this is displaying those messages by using the write host command. Watch what happens when I run that and attempt to redirect the output to output.txt. Output.txt is a 0-byte file. That's because the write host command drew these characters directly on the screen. There's no possibility of redirecting those. And that's actually the big limitation with write host. You can't capture it. Now let's go back to that idea of me having some sort of runbook automation tool that is running scheduled PowerShell tasks in the background. If I was using write host to display status information, hey, I'm working on the first user, I added him to his group, I'm setting up his file share. If I used write host to display those messages, my runbook automation tool would not be able to capture that information and store it in a log because write host doesn't write to any of the pipelines. Here's another way to look at that. Write host testing, where $_length is greater than 10. Now this is saying I want to write host testing, but I only want to keep strings that are longer than 10 characters. Testing appeared anyway. That's because write host drew the word testing directly on the screen. There was nothing piped to where object. It had no input to work with, so it just didn't do anything. Let's contrast that with another command, write output, which has the alias write. Write output actually put the string object testing into the pipeline. It was then piped to where object. Where object filtered it out because that string's length property was not greater than 10. Let's change it to greater than 1. You can see now that it passed. So write output actually puts things into that first output pipeline. There are a lot of other commands. Let's look at all of the commands that use the verb write. And there's a few of these in particular that I want to call to your attention. Write debug puts things in that debug pipeline. Write error. Write host we've talked about writes directly to the screen. There's the output pipeline, the verbose pipeline, and the warning pipeline. You can also draw information directly on the screen in a slightly different way by using write progress. That displays a sort of text-based progress bar when you're here in the console and a pop-up graphical progress bar when you're using the ISE. There's also write event log, which really has nothing to do with any of these, but it does share that same verb write, which is why it appeared on this list. So the idea is in a script, if you want to write a particular type of information, you need to think about which of these write commands is the most appropriate. Now I'm a big fan of writing scripts and giving them names that look like PowerShell command names. For example, I have this sample.ps1 that I just ran, remember? Did that. Sample is not really a PowerShell command name. It doesn't have a verb and a noun. So let me rename that. I'll rename sample.ps1 to show welcome message.ps1. Now the script's file name more accurately reflects what it does. The word show as a verb tells me that this command is not going to produce output. It is going to draw a message directly on the console screen. So when I run this, I have a good expectation. The show verb suggests that this won't work because it's just showing information on the screen, not redirecting it into the pipeline so that I can redirect it into a text file. Look at the difference. The verb get implies that I'm retrieving information, and because it goes in the output pipeline, at the end of the pipeline, PowerShell puts it on the screen. But if I redirect it before it gets to the screen, see, I got nothing on the screen. Because those service objects went into the output pipeline, I was able to redirect them. And now you'll notice that output txt has a length quite a bit greater than 0 because it's containing all that same information that would have appeared on the screen. So again, that's the big difference. The show verb is the one to use if your script is predominantly just displaying information on the screen. And there's certainly times when you might want to do that. You might want to make a little command line menu for your help desk so that you give them a set of options and they choose which one they want to execute. There's no need for that menu to ever go any place but on the screen. And you might want to use colors and other things to highlight certain portions. It brings people attention over. That's a perfect way to use WriteHost. And you would name that script something like show. Maybe the name of the script would be show help desk menu. Pretty straightforward. That tells me what it's going to do. How would you go about prompting for information? Well, that is the read host command. You give it a prompt. You'll notice that it appends a colon to the end of that prompt automatically. Whatever you enter goes into the pipeline. And so since that was the end of the pipeline, it displays on the screen. Let's try this. I'm going to be prompted. I'll type a 6-character string, which was not long enough to make it through the where object command. We'll run it again. That should be well over. It runs through the where object command and appears on the screen because it was at the end of the pipeline at that point. More commonly, again, it adds the colon at the end of the prompt for me. And now whatever I typed will be in the $computer name variable. So it's more common to ask for input using read host, capture that information into a variable so that you can then use it somewhere else in your script. Now that's an appropriate way to collect information. The downside is it is interactive. It is reading from the console. Now, there's a lot of times when you're going to want to run scripts that are not going to run interactively in front of a human being. And so there's other ways to provide input. When you do it that way, you kind of make sure that the script is not going to hang with that prompt there waiting for input. And we're going to cover all the different ways to do that, to parameterize the input, to specify things as being mandatory, and even to get PowerShell to prompt automatically rather than having to manually use read host. But read host is a great way, again, if you're writing a script whose primary purpose is to interact on the screen in front of a human being, like the idea of a help desk menu. You might use write host to display the menu options, and then use read host to allow them to enter the menu option they actually want to execute. Now, some of those other means of displaying information are a little tricky to use. Here's a good example. Write verbose, hi. Where'd it go? Yeah, see, the trick is that of those 5 pipelines, 2 of them, verbose and debug, are turned off by default. Kind of like a valve at the end of the pipeline. You can put things into the pipeline, but there's no way for them to get out and show up on the screen. Set verbose preference equal to continue, and you open the valve, and that's what verbose output looks like by default. When you want to shut that output back off again, change verbose preference to silently continue, and everything just goes away, never shows up on the screen. Now we need to point out that I've said that there's not really output necessarily when you're just creating a file. For example, dir pipe to dir.txt did create a text file on disk, but there's nothing on the screen, so there's no output. Here's a better way to look at that, perhaps. Instead of using the angle bracket redirector, I'll actually go with the more formal PowerShell syntax. Outfile dir.txt does the same thing. Over here, I might say copy those files to CHTML. Well, do I even have an HTML directory? No. Here's the deal. This got all the files, piped it to here, which did create the file on disk. It's right there. But this command did not produce any output, meaning it did not write anything to the output pipeline. So there was nothing in the pipeline at this point, and so nothing got passed to this command, and since it had no input, it didn't do anything. So just because you've created a file on disk does not necessarily mean you've created output. That is, it doesn't mean you've written to the output pipeline. If you run a command like this and there's nothing on the screen afterwards, that's because there was nothing in the output pipeline to be picked up and shown on the screen. Just remember that distinction. A file or a registry or anything else is not output, at least as PowerShell uses that term. Now, hopefully now you've got a good idea of what output really means in Windows PowerShell. It's not writing to the screen, and it's not just dumping a bunch of data into a file on disk or anywhere else. You can write to the host, and there are times when you might want to do so, but you're primarily going to focus on writing to the output pipeline. Or depending, if you need to display that warm, fuzzy, step-by-step type stuff, there's a verbose pipeline for that, and some other ways that you can create information. But information on the screen is not necessarily the same as output. Now, I also showed you how to prompt for information by using read host. Now, these are all foundations that we're going to start using more and more as we go forward. I wanted to make sure we cleared up any confusion about what these different commands do and which ones you want to use and don't want to use before we went any further. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.